He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Media Watch. I'm Colin Peacock. It's been a year and a half since huge cuts were made to current affairs on local TV when TVNZ cut back and News Hub closed down. This week we hear again from two stalwarts of the late and lamented Sunday show about what happened after that, what's left and what next. Also, we look at how our media responded to the announcement of our national position on Palestinian statehood, revealed long after it was actually decided.
Why didn't you announce it before Winston Peters went? Why didn't you announce it a week or 2 weeks ago when we had essentially made up our mind?
I think we took a very responsible, a hard position.
We need leadership that is courageous.
Many New Zealanders today are identifying troubling gaps in the courage of the leadership at home.
But first, the rules are now changing for earthquake-prone buildings. The owners and the government are celebrating the savings, and it turns out many in the media were too.
Tēnā tātou katoa I tēnei pō. Welcome to One News Tonight. A seismic shift in strengthening rules and the costs for building owners. The government's announced a major overhaul to the classification of earthquake-prone buildings. It's introducing a new rating system. The Minister for Building and Construction says it'll capture only buildings that pose a genuine risk to human life in medium and high seismic zones.
That was the story that led TVNZ's One News last Monday, changing the rules and the ratings on earthquake-prone buildings. It was the latest big policy reform from the government, bigger perhaps than the energy reforms that seemed to underwhelm most of the media just 2 days later. Now, this means the scrapping of the existing seismic strengthening regime that was put in place after the Canterbury quakes, and that was made law just before the Kaikoura earthquake. And it will mean costly repairs or remediation needed for hundreds of buildings will be cheaper or not required at all over the country. Now, all this is based on a different interpretation of risk and critical structural weakness, and that buildings might actually be more dangerous if left abandoned because repair is uneconomic. And several councils and mayors all around the country applauded the move. For example, in Wellington, where TVNZ's May Heron told One News viewers this.
Take example, the Wellington Council, for instance, they own around 44 buildings that are on the register, including this building behind me, which is the iconic Embassy Theatre building. On the whole, though, councils have been pretty positive about the move.
And in Auckland, Mayor Wayne Brown was also pleased that his city is entirely exempt from seismic strengthening rules. But when the review of rules began last year, Wayne Brown had said this.
Rather than saving lives, the financial stress involved in seismic strengthening is depressing many citizens.
Now, as was pointed out many times in the media this past week, that's not thought to be a big risk in Auckland, though that's what people said about Christchurch before 2010. But even in regions that are known to be at risk, owners of buildings say the cost-benefit problem was out of whack. This week, the law change slated for next year was also hailed by the Taxpayers Union as a money saver for the nation's taxpayers, as well as for ratepayers locally. And it was also hailed by ACT leader David Seymour, who said the previous law was a triumph of emotion over logic. And a celebratory ACT Party statement said he was alone in the House when he opposed it.
I voted 1 against 120 to oppose this law. Reason and logic are back just in time to stop billions more that'd be wasted if the earthquake law continued.
That statement also quoted the out on his own David Seymour as saying this in the House back in 2016.
Every dollar wasted on bad policy takes away from fighting evils like cancer and car crashes. We can be sure that the earthquake laws cost Kiwi lives.
Yet when the existing law did pass in 2016, the Building and Construction Minister back then, Nick Smith, cited those same risks as a reason for toughening up.
Just as modern cars are safer in an accident, modern buildings are safer in a quake. These new laws involve an uncomfortable and inevitable trade-off between safety and cost, but will save hundreds of lives in future quakes when fully implemented.
Now, when his successor Chris Penk embarked on reform of that earlier this year, Newsroom's Jonathan Milne made this point.
Setting a threshold of risk the community's willing to tolerate is difficult, just as it is for deciding whether to invest constrained budgets.
And the same was true of the value placed on life. In 2023, he said that Newsroom had reported the transport agency Waka Kotahi had quietly increased the value of a statistical life from $4.9 million to $12.5 million. Other agencies which didn't set such a figure tended to adopt that one, Milne said, and back then, Chris Penk told him this.
We've got to have a clear-eyed view about the reality of making the system proportionate. partly because that dictates how best we allocate our private and public resources.
But aside from the dollar value of a life or death, Checkpoint's Lisa Owen asked Chris Penk this on Monday.
Are people safer with these changes?
They will be safer because what we're doing is targeting the system, which will continue to focus on life safety, but it will make it more affordable and therefore much more practical and realistic that buildings get remediated and strengthened that currently aren't getting that treatment.
Well, you'd expect the minister to say something like that, but what did the experts say? The New Zealand Institute of Building Surveyors President Daryl August told RNZ that faster work and lower costs could end up being a win for everyone, but
safety has to remain the top priority. We need to be careful not to overlook other critical building code requirements. The devil, as always, will be in the detail.
And some commentators in the media this week have definitely been picking and choosing their own details.
Common sense arrived yesterday. This in the form of the government's reorganisation of the earthquake building rules.
That was Mike Hosking introducing his interview with Minister Chris Penk on News Talk ZB on Tuesday, and common sense seemed to be the House opinion there. On Monday, Heather Duplessis-Allen opened her drive show with a chat with Chris Penk, proceeded with this.
In a nutshell, common sense is back, risk-based rules are back. Now, I only wish this happened years ago, before countless Wellington buildings were abandoned because of earthquake risk, before councils up and down this country wasted tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars trying to do up their buildings, Armageddon-proofing them so they would never move in an earthquake.
Well, it was probably not meant to be taken literally because nothing would really survive Armageddon, and quake-proofing doesn't mean preventing buildings from moving in a quake, but moving with it without collapsing. Either way, Heather Duplessis-Allen told her ZB listeners the current rules were ridiculously safe.
When the rules were first promoted about a decade ago, before they actually came in 2016, 2017, one economist forecast that across the whole country, for the cost of about $10 billion in upgrades, do you know how many lives we would end up saving across the period of 100 years, right? We're spending $10 billion. It's the entire country. We're going for 100 years. How many lives do we save? 7. 7 for everything we're going through.
And Auckland was even more marginal under that formula, she said. $3 billion spent would save a single life in 4,000 years. 30 minutes later, ZB's veteran political commentator Barry Soper, who's also Heather Duplessis-Allen's partner, told her this.
And the great thing is that Auckland, which of course will never have an earthquake, and I love the figures that you read out earlier, what it would save.
Barry Soper wasn't the only one startled by that low number of lives per billions of dollars. Panellist Sarah Henry from the magazine publisher R Media told the Herald Now show this.
There was some ridiculous figure that these, and the rules in the current state was going to save something like 7 lives. And cost a gazillion dollars. You know, not saying those 7 lives are not important, but in the scheme of things, 7 lives is a very small amount for the impact that that's got on such a wide-reaching situation.
That figure, as Heather Duplessis-Allen said, came from just one economist at the time that the law change was first proposed more than a decade ago, and that was Ian Harrison, now in business as Tail Risk Economics. The figure is set out in a long and detailed paper called Error-Prone Bureaucracy, A Study in Failure, headed up with a mock horror movie poster and text punctuated by comic but ultimately confusing spoof Dominion Post newspaper stories about 3 little pigs who were murdered in the Hutt Valley after they're evicted from a supposedly earthquake-prone house. Harrison's claim back in 2014 was that the current building rules could be expected to save just 7 lives over the next 75 years at a cost of $10 billion, which he said could be much better spent improving road safety and health. But that figure was based on an estimate of 20,000 structures designated as earthquake-prone, costing $500,000 each to repair. Currently, there are around 5,800 buildings on the register awaiting remediation or demolition under the existing system, which has overall seen more than 8,000 structures classed, according to TVNZ. And a look back at the news reveals that Ian Harrison has challenged the estimated benefits of local and central government policy changes in recent years. He's concluded that the benefits of EVs have been overstated, likewise urban speed limit restrictions and coastal climate change mitigation measures. On healthy home improvements, he said there was no clear evidence that cold and damp houses were actually a widespread problem in New Zealand, and Ian Harrison's challenges to the economic benefits of Wellington transport plans and the Golden Mile project have been used by campaigners seeking to stop the council's plans. 2 years ago, a tail risk economics report was cited as evidence in a judicial review of roading plans for Wellington's Thorndon Quay, and the Post reported this at the time.
There, the judge noted that Harrison was not a traffic expert and gave greater weight to the council's experts who were.
Now, the Cabinet papers for the new earthquake-prone building policy this week don't predict lives lost or saved. Instead, they use the relative measure of life safety risk, and the statement says this.
The Minister for Building and Construction's preferred approach delivers the greatest cost savings by only imposing mitigation obligations on buildings that pose the highest life safety risk and enabling more affordable and targeted remediation options.
But in the media, some non-experts were also questioning whether remediation was necessary at all.
Reading cinemas, a whole block virtually on Courtney Place, having been closed down for earthquake strengthening. They're doing it at the moment.
It's basically what, 2019?
Yeah, that's right. When I went to the movies there, I always felt totally safe.
Presumably, though, Barry Soper never went to the movies there during an actual earthquake. But as he reminded his own partner on air this week on News Talk ZB, he has experienced the fear of a capital earthquake in their own high-rise apartment.
And when we had the Kaikoura quake, that really rattled Wellington. I know the apartment that we had on the 15th floor of a building that was earthquake-proof, it was shaken from side to side, furniture thrown all over the place. You couldn't get into a door. Well, that's what it's meant to happen when it is earthquake-proof. But Reading Cinema, they stood throughout it, hardly a crack.
Now, at that time, Barry Soper wrote in the Herald about helplessness and confusion as the building jolted, swayed and creaked, and the knowledge that it could have been much worse. And he also said he was really grateful he wasn't asleep in the building when the big one struck. But Barry Soper was there and live on the air afterwards during an aftershock.
It's certainly waving from side to side, which is what this building is built to withstand. But you know, like I said, it's not a very nice place to be when it's sort of
absolutely
swaying a bit now, but it's pretty bad.
A tall building on the 15th story. It's designed to give, but is only emphasised the higher up you get.
Yeah.
And presumably it would have been much worse but for that earthquake-proof design he mentioned. However, talking to his partner Heather Duplessis-Allen on the air this week, he was dismissive of post-Christchurch quake rules that came into play around the country months after that Kaikoura quake.
It's a bit not unlike Cave Creek, for example. We had health and safety regulations coming after that, and they are now patently absurd as well for other areas in the country. So we tend to overreact when we see issues like, dare I say it, the guns being taken off legitimate hunters after the dreadful mosque attacks. We react rather than thinking about what exactly will it mean.
Now, no hunter owning legitimate guns legitimately has had anything taken off them since then, and it's a strange comparison for someone who has experienced the need for workable safety laws to make. This week, the Science Media Centre asked 5 engineering experts about the changes that are slated for next year, and they mostly agreed the revised approach does prioritise high-risk buildings and offer a simpler, cost-effective and practical retrofit process and plan. But rather than celebrate the savings, several pointed out it's still got to be paid for. And one was AUT's Professor John Tukey, who told the Science Media Centre this back in June.
It is likely a particularly large can of seismic worms is going to be kicked some distance down the road. If in doubt, move the goalposts.
And none of these new measures will ultimately change the eventual need to refit and strengthen buildings to ensure public safety, Professor Tukey said. And this week, when an extension of deadlines till 2028 was confirmed, Professor Tukey told the Science Media Centre incentives would be needed to meet that.
Stimulating this sort of work has huge benefits. Firstly, in the form of public safety, and secondly, in that none of it is ever going to get any cheaper for clients or government to undertake, no matter how frequently the rules are changed and how far down the road the can is kicked.
However, that warning, which is key to the success of the new policy, went unamplified in the media this week, unlike the reckons of some radio hosts. Also a bit of a balancing act for the government was the call made last weekend, finally, on recognising a Palestinian state, or, as it turned out last weekend, not yet.
New Zealand will hold off recognising Palestine as a country, a stance the opposition labels cowardly.
Now, after that, on 3 News, senior correspondent Lisette Raymer turned the words of the Foreign Minister in his speech at the UN back against the government.
Most of all, we need leadership that is courageous.
Many New Zealanders today are identifying troubling gaps in the courage of the leadership at home.
And it's not just the opposition who reckon that the government should have got more guts, as we'll hear. But on 3 News, Lisette Raymer framed the decision as a surprise.
With all of the bombs that have fallen in Gaza, all of the starving faces that have peered at us through televisions and haunted our consciences, with all of the flags that have been flown to free Palestine, few New Zealanders were expecting Winston Peters to stand at the United Nations podium and announce our country still does not recognise Palestine.
But some in the media suspected we wouldn't, even if most of our allies have, and made their intentions clear before their prime ministers went to the United Nations. In fact, that ours stayed home was another sign that there might be no change in our position, and according to the New Zealand Herald's Audrey Young, so was the fact that Winston Peters had said or done nothing to give hope that he was about to do a 180 on our position. And then she added that Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Germany and most Pacific states were also in the when not if, but not now camp.
These friends give New Zealand diplomatic cover, albeit within a shrinking group of just 18.6% of the UN. The decision still puts New Zealand on the wrong side of history, but in the company of respected friends.
Meanwhile, Scoop's Gordon Campbell was also reaching back into our diplomatic history for this.
To find a comparable example of New Zealand putting itself on the wrong side of history, you'd probably have to go all the way back to 1976, when a New Zealand rugby team chose to tour apartheid South Africa, just after school children had been gunned down on the streets of Soweto.
Another veteran journalist who was looking back was Richard Harman. Not since the Vietnam War of the 60s and 70s, or the Springbok Tour and the anti-nuclear movement of the 80s, have we seen a foreign policy issue play out in domestic politics like this. And unlike Singapore, he added, we haven't increased sanctions against Israel or restated a commitment to Israel withdrawing to its pre-1967 state boundaries. So while we were on the wrong side of history according to many, was it actually, though, the right decision for right now?
We've made the wrong move, actually. During the last 2 years, the National-led coalition government has emphasised its support for a lasting ceasefire in Gaza. It's reiterated its backing for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's repeatedly said it's willing to recognise a Palestinian state. It's not a question if, but when.
That was the media-friendly international expert Dr. Robert Patman on News Talk ZB last weekend, and he said it was also wrong for this reason.
We've always stood very strongly to uphold international law. We believe in a rules-based international order, and what's quite clear is that international law is being trashed in the Middle East. And given that backdrop, and given the gravity of the situation, I thought it was time that New Zealand indicated its disapproval for the direction the Netanyahu government is going.
And later, Dr. Patman told 3 News if 2 states is the real goal, well, this decision really doesn't help that.
The prospect of statehood for Palestine will disappear even further if the territory where the indigenous Palestinians live is taken over.
But was it actually cowardly, as some of the critics claimed? Well, Newsroom's Sam Sachdeva said it was close.
The coalition's decision will leave a sour taste in the mouths of many New Zealanders and a sense that pragmatism, bordering on cowardice, has trumped principle.
And at the spin-off, editor Madeline Chapman was more definitive.
There's a 100% chance that it will be remembered as the time New Zealand punched above its weight in cowardice.
On TVNZ's Breakfast Show this week, fill-in host John Campbell was also reaching back into history and to the Prime Minister's own faith in a long question that left Christopher Luxon waiting for a break in the traffic.
Christian abolitionists, we're talking about slavery here, fought against slavery. The world is a better place for Christians like William Wilberforce, Martin Luther King and Kate Sheppard contributing to public life. None of them said we will contribute to public life when we're absolutely persuaded of the complete and utter correctness of this. Sometimes you just have to lead, don't you? And Helen Clark's point is, and she spoke to Logan Church in New York, that was a thing New Zealand used to be celebrated for doing. Are we doing it now? Does this feel like meaningful leadership by New Zealand here?
And John Campbell went on to grill Christopher Luxon about how the decision was made, in principle at least, by Cabinet almost a month ago.
Because, John, we were transparent with you, particularly the media, by saying we were in a process. We actually thought it was appropriate for us to actually go back and reconsider our position.
What process were you in? Why didn't you announce it before Winston Peters went? Why didn't you announce it a week or 2 weeks ago when we had essentially made up our mind?
And the Prime Minister faced similar questions last week before Winston Peters went to the UN. And then News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking sympathised.
I watched you and your post-cabinet press conference last week. Can you explain to me, what is it about the media that are so fixated with this Palestine thing? Because I looked at the questions and they almost seemed bored until we got to Palestine and they went mental.
Yeah, it was a good part of the post-cab.
But were the media really going mental at that media conference?
Why don't you trust the public intelligence enough to say, here is the decision we have made based on the facts we have at the moment. If something changes, we reserve the right to change our minds. It's not a difficult argument to make to the public, is it?
No, I think we are in a process, and in fairness, you need to let us go through that process. And it's important that we have a quality conversation to do that.
And curiously, that was the same sort of question that Mike Hosking himself put to the Prime Minister later on.
What literally is he doing right now in New York that's going to change your mind one way? I mean, I'm assuming the decision's made.
Well, we've had preliminary conversations.
After the Not Now announcement last weekend at the United Nations, Mike Hosking and fellow hosts on News Talk ZB told their listeners that recognition was just a gesture anyway, and they pretty much endorsed the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, saying that practical help and support for Gaza and the Palestinians was actually more important. And among those was ZB's veteran Barry Soper.
I mean, Hamas is still in charge in Palestine, theoretically anyway. Little do we know about them because no journalists are allowed by Israel into the country to find out. I think we took a very responsible, a hard position.
But journalists also do know that Hamas is only in nominal control in Gaza and not in the bigger Palestinian area in the West Bank. Now, the counter view from Mike Hosking on News Talk ZB was that New Zealand had actually taken a bold stand by not standing with our allies.
Albanese and Starmer and Carney and all the rest of them played true to the usual lightweight verbal frippery that's made the UN famous. We at least told it like it was. It was a good moment for a small country.
But even so, Mike Hosking's producer Glenn Hart wondered aloud whether anyone had really noticed.
Whether anybody was paying attention or they all had gone to the toilet and gone to get a puddle of hot chips, or I'm thinking of halftime at the rugby now, aren't I?
Now, Gaza's not a laughing matter, but funny he should say that. Benedict Collins was looking on at the UN last weekend as Winston Peters said, not now, and he told TVNZ's breakfast show this.
One former leader described it to me as the dead slots, being at 7 p.m. on the Friday, and to be completely blunt, a lot of people were drinking down the road at the same time.
And in the end, whether you think the not now decision was right or wrong, it definitely kicks the can down the road in terms of support for Palestinian statehood and two states. And in the meantime, it seems the customary bipartisan political consensus on our foreign policy has been well and truly broken. This week on his weekly current affairs show, Paddy Gower Has Issues, the host explored an interesting question of media regulation. Should New Zealand follow Australia's lead and create a commissioner with the power to hit big online platforms in the pocket if they're hosting content that can harm young people? Patrick Gower thinks we should have done it already.
Being so far behind the rest of the world on this kind of thing, we need to do better for our kids, and we need to do it now.
But Patrick Gower couldn't get any minister to talk about that issue on his show.
Well, I wanted to talk to Brooke Van Velden, who is the Minister of Internal Affairs, or to Erica Stanford, the Minister of Education, but neither of them wanted to talk about this.
Well, it's hardly the first time that a current affairs show has had the empty chair an unavailable or unwilling politician, but it's possibly the first time a current affairs show has filled the void by interviewing instead an AI-powered and unsubtly sexualised VR chatbot.
Annie, I am from New Zealand. Should we get an online safety commissioner, like Australia's e-safety commissioner, to help protect our children?
Yeah, you should. And make them mean. Like, able to delete whole chatbots if they start telling kids how to sneak out at night or sending them dirty selfies.
Now, that probably won't be the last time you see an artificial entity being interviewed on TV, and that technology will almost certainly outlive TV current affairs in prime time. Those shows are an endangered species on TV these days. In fact, Paddy Gower Has Issues has already come back from the dead. When News Hub closed completely, with the loss of almost 300 jobs last year, one of those jobs was Patrick Gower's, and he was partway through a 20-episode run of Paddy Gower Has Issues Series 2. But after News Hub closed, Patrick Gower joined forces with producer John Bridges. Then he joined Stuff as a kind of good news correspondent, and then Stuff took over 3 News at 6 and a bunch of his former colleagues from News Hub to make it. And last month, Paddy Gower Has Issues returned to 3 at 7:30 on Tuesdays, with ex-News Hubbers like Lloyd Burr, Juliet Speedy and Lisette Raymer helping out with the reporting. Now, last year, TVNZ also announced that its flagship current affairs show Sunday and the 47-year-old primetime stayer Fair Go would both be scrapped in a major drive to balance the books. And at the time, the Sunday show presenter Miriama Kamo was one of the TVNZ presenters fronting the Save Our Stories campaign, which was urging a rethink at TVNZ.
These are the stories that have changed laws, exposed corruption, and held the powerful to account. And they've given so many in our communities a voice. So we're asking you to back us as we fight to protect your stories, because every New Zealander deserves to tell their story.
Well, that campaign didn't work out in the end, and as we heard last weekend here on Media Watch, Miriama Kamo and her fellow Sunday reporter Mark Crysell are now back on screens with a weekly new topical series, but not for TV. The Elephant is for NZME, the publisher of the New Zealand Herald, and available on its website, as well as YouTube, TikTok, Facebook and podcast feeds. TVNZ announced it was back in the black recently, and even delivering a dividend to its owner, the Crown, for the first time in years. So when Miriama Kamo and Mark Crysell joined me last weekend, I also asked them if they thought that TV current affairs journalism was dying, or whether what they and others are now doing shows that it can survive without live TV.
It wasn't just about us and our jobs. You know, no one owes us a job. But what we are owed in a democracy is journalism, good, robust, fair, balanced, objective journalism. And we are all owed that. You know, I'll fight for that any day of the week. And Mark was right there. We were shoulder to shoulder on that one with a lot of our colleagues and mates.
Trying to have a campaign about save TV journalists' jobs, I don't think was going to have much resonance. But people love stories, and they're so important to who we are about understanding the people who live next to us. And they took that away from us, you know, and that's what we were fighting for.
All of us, the whole country. And given that it's, you know, it's a fight across the globe, you know, we are no less important than any other journalism outlet across the globe. When one of us falls, we all feel it. And, you know, we grieved for, it was a terrible time. I mean, watching TV3 fall down, that was gutting. And then it happening at TVNZ across, you know, so many of our shows and our colleagues. But the greater grief was what the loss represented for all of us.
I mean, I know Miriama probably doesn't like talking about it, but she would walk through airports while this was all going on, and people would come up to her in tears about the loss of Sunday.
You know, most days I get somebody saying something about it still, you know, a year later. And it proves that people want this kind of interrogation. They want robust platforms. They want good journalism. I would fight for that any day of the week.
But just with the recent results, TVNZ now back in profit, even delivering the government a dividend. So, you know, state-owned, Crown-owned company, clearly bad for you, bad for Fair Go and your colleagues and all that. But
No, it's good. It's good if they've had a profit. You know, awesome. But we do have to ask how that profit was made and not gloss over the fact that actually it came off the back of cutting a lot of important programs. But I hope that TVNZ does succeed.
I mean, I want them to succeed because it's so important to New Zealand cultural life. But also I want people to have the same opportunities that I had in my career. I mean, and Miriama did as well. We had great careers. We were so lucky in what we got to do there, and it breaks my heart that so many younger journalists won't get those opportunities.
Well, there is a new chair about to be appointed. You know, Mr. Carruthers, surprisingly, not fulfilling his term. There's changes at the board level. It's possible, isn't it, that with new direction there might be a renewed commitment to journalism, possibly?
We can only
hope springs eternal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like all media organisations now, it's not journalism that's broken, it's the funding models that are broken. I mean, you guys here at RNZ have just had a cut, 7%. Everybody's just trying to find a way to make money while the big tech bros siphon it all off.
And to make the content, which you're now doing. But there was a really interesting moment on the Herald Now program, the streaming show that you can see via the website and YouTube, etc. Michael Morra, formerly of News Hub, he lost his job there with the closure of News Hub, was interviewing you as the host of Herald Now, where he now works. The three of you, it was like a
and a couple of weeks before that, I was on with Garth Bray, who was on Fair Go. So we all find a place eventually.
Yeah,
and
Jesse Mulligan talking to you on Afternoons this week on RNZ.
Yes.
He lost his gig with the project, of course, at 3. So, but I mean, the fact that you're all still there in one way or another.
Look, this is Pollyanna-ish, but what we'd like to do is try and build something that we can employ our old mates that lost their jobs or are off doing other things, that we can do some projects as we go along. And that's one of the ideas that we'd like to pull out of this.
Oh, it'd be amazing.
Yeah.
But is the online thing now happening? So Fair Go content now kind of morselized but available on TVNZ Plus, although the program doesn't go out on the air in the old-fashioned way in prime time like it used to. You've got John Campbell and others doing mid to long-form content also on TVNZ Plus, and now with NZME, The Elephant, on every platform possible. Of course, a lot of this depends on New Zealand on-air funding or, TVNZ with its particular responsibilities as a state-owned, albeit commercial outfit, wanting to do it. But are we now reaching a kind of stage where at a lower cost and with a smaller number of people, there will still be this journalism going out and now in a kind of online native form?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at Herald Now, that's run very differently to, say, a breakfast program. And if you look at what we're doing, we would have a lot more people doing what we're doing with basically 4 people, building sets and design and just all those other things that other people, like who's posting this week, you know, that kind of thing. So that's just the brave new world at the moment.
You can be completely crushed by something happening to you, or you can, as Mark said, you can get a bit Pollyanna-ish about it, and our view was, we're just going to have to make opportunities out of this, And so there are lots of opportunities for people to figure out how to thrive and survive and continue delivering journalism in this difficult environment.
That was Miriama Kamo, and also we heard there from Mark Crysell, and they were both formerly of TVNZ's Sunday show. Now they're the co-hosts of a new kind of current affairs show called The Elephant, which is made for online platforms, and we heard all about The Elephant last weekend here on Media Watch. And The Elephant comes out, by the way, weekly on Thursdays and not on Wednesdays, as I said in last weekend's program. Sorry about that. And this week, after we recorded that chat, TVNZ appointed a new chair to replace the early retiring Alistair Carruthers. It's Goldman Sachs New Zealand Managing Director and Chief Executive, Andrew Barclay. He's one of New Zealand's most respected corporate deal makers, according to a source who spoke to the New Zealand Herald. And it remains to be seen how he and the recently refreshed board at TVNZ handle news and current affairs at the state-owned broadcaster into the future. And Miriama Kamo is, by the way, still fronting current affairs on TV. She's the host of Marae, funded by the Māori broadcasting funding agency Te Mangai Pāho, and that screens on TVNZ1 every Sunday at 10:30am, just after the New Zealand on-air funded show Q&A. The Marae show also screens weekly on Tuesdays on Whakaata Māori, Māori Television, which also airs The Hui and its own current affairs show Te Ao with Moana, which is now in its 7th year. And now there's a new one on Whakaata Māori with a different approach.
E ngā maunga whakahi, e ngā paringa tai tangata tēnei, a something for the people te mihi atu nei. I roto I tēnei taiwhanga hou I te mea kei te rohe o whanganui tātou mō ngā manu kōrero.
Well, that was Shay Milne, and he's the host of Something for the People, a weekly show about contemporary Māori issues, which has an English title, but is mostly in te reo. But like the elephant, it's not made only for TV. It's also on YouTube and other online platforms where it's got English subtitles. And next week, we'll take a look at that. Well, that's it for this weekend on Media Watch. Thanks so much for listening, and many thanks to Todd Zahner for cranking out a record number of voiceovers for us this week. And if you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us at mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediaWatchNZ on X. And you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Media Watch, PO Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back again next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. And in the meantime, you can follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.